Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through 10 essential jazz rock albums. They're not ranked and they would not appear necessarily on my 10 greatest jazz rock albums list or 10 most influential or important. These are albums that get forgotten, but for me they were equally great as some of the more well-known and more influential albums. So on here we're going to have 10 essential albums. If you're a serious jazz rock fan, jazz fusion fan, you should at least have a listen to these, if not own them. Right, so I'm going to start off with number one. They're not ranked, right? They're not in any particular order. This is the first one on my list, an absolute classic jazz rock album by Billy Cobham, recorded in 1974, and it's called Total Eclipse. Now, of course, Billy Cobham came to fame as the drummer with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. That skyrocketed into sort of superstardom within the jazz rock world. He then whilst the Mahavishnu Orchestra was still running, he went out and made a solo album. He was the only guy in the Mahavishnu Orchestra to do that whilst the band was still going. And he made a solo album called Spectrum that has gone on to become the classic jazz rock album. And if anybody was going to buy one album by Billy Cobham, it would be Spectrum. Right, my favourite album by Billy Cobham is actually the one that followed that up the following year, Crosswinds. It's one of the first jazz rock albums I ever heard, and it got me into the genre. So I've spoken a lot about Crosswinds. This one, however, this could well be his finest achievement, especially if you're a progressive rock fan. This one is the most bombastic, heavy, over-the-top album he ever made, right? Made right at the peak of prog and influenced by that. In fact, it opens up, right? The opening track is called Solarization. And it's a suite of music in 5 parts. Solarization, second phase, Crescent Sun, Voyage, and then Solarization, recapitulation. It's like prog. Well, it's more like modern classical jazz rock. It's incredible. The band on here is just, it's that classic band that did 4 albums that has the Brecker Brothers in. It's like a forerunner of the Brecker Brothers, and it could be really funky. And tracks like Lunaputians and Bandits and Mood Germs, they are really funky. Total Eclipse is unbelievable and features an incredible, short but mind-blowing soprano sax solo by Michael Brecker. You don't hear one of those every day. Of course, he's incredible on it. When you flip it up onto side 2, after the very funky Moon Germs, we have like a suite of music. Again, another little epic, which is basically 3 tracks that run into each other. The Moon Ain't Made of Green Cheese, which is a solo piano piece by Billy. And then this long blowing, far out, burning jazz rock track called The Sea of Tranquility. And then we end with The Last Frontier, which is a studio recorded drum solo by Billy Cobham. And of his studio recorded drum solos, there's a ton on Spectrum. There's a real brilliant one on Crosswinds, which he makes an impression of a storm. But this is him just doing full-on Billy Cobham, beautifully recording in the studio. It sounds amazing. It is amazing. So that there is without doubt an essential jazz rock album, as is this one by Jean-Luc Ponty. Now, of course, when we think of Jean-Luc Ponty, we think of the post-Mahavishnu Orchestra albums, don't we? We think of things like Imaginary Voice and Cosmic Messenger and all those incredible albums, which are essential jazz rock albums, and we forget the stuff he did earlier on, especially this one, King Kong, which he made in collaboration with Frank Zappa. Now, of course, I thought, shall I put some Zappa on this list? Because he often gets forgotten when we start talking about jazz rock. And then I thought, yeah, the thing with Zappa is, he's made a few albums that you could call a jazz rock albums. Obviously, Hot Rats, Grand Wazoo, Waka Jawaka, all those albums without a doubt. This one, however, because it's under Jean-Luc Ponty's name, always gets forgotten. For me, it is equal to Hot Rats. It's an absolute masterpiece of an album. It showcases Jean-Luc Ponty, but this is really a Zappa album, right? If we look at the compositions on here, which are all written by Frank Zappa, we've got King Kong, Idiot Bastard Son, 20 Small Guitars, and How Would You Like a Head Like That, which that's a Jean-Luc Ponty composition. Flip it over, and you get the 20-minute epic music for electric violin and low-budget orchestra, which Zappa returned to himself in the mid-70s on one of the Leather albums, I think. I think it's on Orchestral Favourites, I'm not sure. The lineup on here is Jean-Luc Ponty on electric violin. We've got George Duke on electric piano. So it's an early George Duke fusion recording with Zappa. Buell Nidling on bass, incredible legendary bass player. Gene Estes on vibes and percussion. We got Arthur Tripp from the Mothers on drums, and Ian Underwood on tenor sax, who was an incredible player. Ernie Watts appears on tenor sax. John Guerin also appears on drums. We've got the funk bass player Wilton Felder on bass. It's a star-studded affair, this is, and it's mind-blowing, and there is a ton of playing on here. So this here really should be seen as, I think, as one of the essential jazz rock albums. And of course it was made in 1970. So on top of that, it's one of the first jazz rock albums. 1970 is that year when jazz rock suddenly seems to coalesce. Everyone's starting to try and make it work, and they can't quite make it work. And then Six Done, a bit Ill and Silent Way, and then Bitches Brew. Then you get Tony Williams' Lifetime. You get Miles with Jack Johnson. You get Hot Rats, and you get this one. This is a really, really important album. So you get this list out. This is important stuff that gets forgotten. Right, progressive rock fans out there, you may be a fan of the psychedelic insanity of David Allen's Gong. But of course, once David Allen jumped out of his own band and Pierre Moulin took over, it turned into a sort of percussion-heavy Weather Report with Alan Holdsworth on guitar. In fact, one of the greatest jazz rock bands of the later 70s, without a doubt. If we're going to listen to an album, and I would put this on my classic list, it would be Gazieuse, right? But after they made Gazieuse, they returned with this one, Espresso. And Espresso is virtually as good as Gazieuse, right? It really is, right? And in some ways, it's funkier and heavier, right? The lineup is quite incredible. You've got Pierre Moulin on drums, and then we've got on guitar, Bon Lazaga, right? Mick Taylor from the Rolling Stones, yes, and he plays some beautifully funky, and he's an incredible balance to the other guitarist on here, which is Alan Holdsworth. If you like Alan not playing his own stuff and in other bands, this is essential. This is up there with Bundles by Soft Machine. This is up there with UK or One of a Kind by Bill Bruford. Or Gazieuse. This is one of the classic 70s Holdsworth albums. I thought I need to put a Holdsworth album, which is the one we never speak about. And it's this. It's beautifully recorded. Pierre Moulin is one of the most funkiest jazz fusion drummers ever, and he never gets mentioned. Absolutely essential stuff. Right, here's another one. I thought Pat Metheny. If we talk about Pat Metheny, we're going to have Bright Side's Life with Jaco Pastorius on, without a doubt. And then you've got things like Off Ramp. We've got things like Secret Story. There's a whole bunch of albums we're going to go for, and they're classic Pat Metheny albums. My favourite album is Imaginary Day. I think that's an absolute masterpiece. But for an album that really showcases the earlier band to somewhat, although this was a shift, and it really is one of the classic albums by Pat Metheny, I have gone with First Circle. This is an absolute masterpiece and a classic, right? So this is, I think, the last album he made on ECM. Pat Metheny never fitted into the ECM sound, and as time went on and his vision expanded, he came up clashing with Manfred Eicher, who wanted everything to be that sort of spacey, European, reverb-heavy, crystal clear recordings, and he wanted to do something else. So this was his farewell album, and then he went off to Geffen Records, with a major deal, and then becomes one of the biggest selling jazz rock artists of the 1970s, which is surprising, but it's surprising because Pat Metheny can veer towards the avant-garde. So once on Geffen Records, he didn't go all commercial. He made albums like Song X and Zero Tolerance for Silence. This one, I think, is a brilliant summation of what he was doing on ECM Records, which is this very beautiful, it can be quite easy listening. But Burt Bacharach's easy listening, and it's still very complex and heavy, and that's how I see this. The track First Circle that comes in at 10 minutes is like one of Pat's greatest epics. The lineup on here is the classic Pat Metheny and Lyle Mays. They got Steve Robdy on bass, Pedro and Aznar on vocals and percussion, and then I think this is the first album with Paul Wurtico, who would come in and replace Dan Gottlieb. So it's not quite the classic early, lineup that did Travels, but it sort of is, and it's got that sound. And I think this is a really brilliant lineup as well on here. There's a track that ends side one called If I Could, and I think Pat Metheny cites this as being one of the special moments in his catalogue, and he said that they got magic down when they recorded it. It's a very beautiful ballad, and they really did. You feel like you could hear a pin drop. This is a classic jazz rock album, although very light. Not really what we expect from the Mahavishnu Orchestra, or Return to Forever. It's a different type of jazz rock. And with this one, the next one on this is also pushing the realms of what we consider jazz rock to be. One guy that sold millions and millions of albums in the 70s, one of the biggest selling jazz rock artists, was Jeff Beck. But because Jeff Beck came out of that sort of British blues boom and played in things like the Yardbirds and his own group, we don't necessarily think because Jeff Beck has been a jazz rock artist, but in the 70s he was. And he did 4 albums that I would say are classics, especially the first 2, Blow by Blow, Wired, and then the live album with Jan Hammer, and then There and Back. These are 4 classic jazz rock albums. And then he sort of disappears. He stops making albums in the 80s. I think he was too interested in fixing his cars and driving around in hot rods. Anyway, halfway through that decade, the record company persuaded him to do sort of a big label, showcase called Flash, which I actually quite like, but it's very 80s. And then towards the end of that decade, he came back with this album. And this, for me, is one of the classic Jeff Beck albums, right? And it harkens back to Tony Williams' Lifetime and even back to those organ trios, because this is a 3-piece of drums, guitars, and keyboards. The drummer on here is Terry Bozzio, and the keyboardist is Tony Hymas. So Tony Hymas, at this point, using all the synthesizers, is really getting the sound of this huge orchestrated sound, and he's playing bass sounds in here, but there's not a bassist on here, which frees it up. Leif Masses, I believe, recorded this. Engineered and mixed by Leif Masses, who I believe did stuff with Zeppelin. I'm not too sure, but Leif Masses was an incredible engineer. And Terry Bozzio obviously came into the studio with this huge drum kit with million bass drums and cymbals and all this sort of stuff, and he captures this incredible sound. If you think this is just 80s production with tons of reverb on, it's not. This is a real sound. I believe they used over 20 mics on Terry Bozzio's kit, and they got this incredible sound which Terry could hear in the studio. So he could create this monstrous mammoth drum sound that Jeff Beck just sits over the top, and I feel that this captures some of Jeff Beck's great guitaring, because of course his guitaring evolved, and the way he was playing on Wired and Blow by Blow is different to how he played on this. I have a theory that he heard the great Ray Gomez. I've heard a couple of late 70s Ray Gomez albums where he's playing in a style that Jeff Beck seems to have been influenced by, let us say. Of course, when Jeff Beck died, everybody was posting up a track off this album, Where Were You?, which is one of these beautiful ballads where he does all that whammy bar stuff. But it kicks. It kicks, right? And it is full of soloing. It's an instrumental album. This is essentially a jazz rock album in the true meaning of the phrase. So that's what we've got, whatever number that is, right? Let's go right back to the beginning. Let's pull out a really classic early jazz rock, jazz fusion album. I've gone back as early as I can with an absolute classic. Now, there aren't that many classics. People are farting around in the 60s trying to mix jazz and rock, and they're not pulling it off. There's lots of experimentations, but they fail, right? Now, Chico Hamilton, who had been a drummer that emerged in the bebop era and then came in sort of through the West Coast jazz scene in the 50s, When it got to the 60s, straight away he started to take influences from popular music. And what he took was this sort of soulful aspect of the pop music at the time, really drawing on as well from Latin music and almost like African music. And he made a series of albums of the 60s that are absolutely classics. Some may say that this is not a jazz rock album, but I would say if you want a jazz rock collection and you want to go back as early as you can, you would have to have this beast. Now, this was sent to me by one of my lovely viewers, and it's a beautiful gatefold. Isn't that just a work of art, right? And if you look on that beautifully shiny cover, you will see it says The Dealer, Chico Hamilton, introducing Larry Coryell, the father of jazz rock, one of the most underrated musicians in this genre. And who else have we got on here? We've got Richard Davis on bass. Archie Shepp is playing piano on For Mods Only. It's really weird. We've got Eric Hayes on organ and Chico Hamilton on drums. Also Arnie Lawrence on alto saxophone. Right, there is a groove. There is a funkiness to this album, and there is Larry Coryell, who had emerged in the 60s alongside, Pat Martino, alongside George Benson, but was one of the first guitarists of that generation that wasn't just listening to Wes Montgomery, they were also listening to the Beatles and the Stones and country music, and he pulls that in on this album. And there he is featured on the back because Chico knew that that guy there was doing something serious on this album. Essential early jazz rock album. Do you want to know what year it was made? I haven't got a clue. I've got a feeling it's 65. Have we got a date on here? Let's have a look if we can look on the album. Do you want to see the actual album itself? Because this is, look at that, ABC Records. It's absolutely classic. Beautiful. Love records. ABC Impulse. Look at that label. And the date is no date. I think this is actually slightly later looking at that label. But it's, I would say, 1966 for this album. I feel like someone off the Antiques Roadshow, which only British people will understand. There is no date on this. Could be 65, but definitely 66. You could tell me in the comments, but there is no date on this album. So you should have done the research before you did this, Andy, shouldn't you? But my knowledge is there. I would say 65, 66. That's where I would say that is. Right. Those who love the Mavish Orchestra will love the fact that the Mavish Orchestra don't just play jazz rock and jazz fusion. They bring in to jazz rock this sort of spiritual element. Those of us who love all the mystical, spiritual enlightenment stuff, right? That extra ingredient that makes jazz rock just so trippy and out there. You could ask yourself, what other albums are like that? Is there any other jazz rock albums that are like that have that sort of out spiritualness? Well, this album is probably one of the most out and out spiritual, another dimension. Let's take us up to wherever the creator lives and all that type of stuff. And it is a solo album by the guitarist Carlos Santana, or as he's called here, Devadip, and it is called Oneness, Silver Dreams, Golden Reality, right? Look at the cover. We have there Eternal Recurrence as the Buddha goes back into the infinite mists of time. This is full on, whatever you want to call this sort of genre of mystical jazz rock. Look inside, look at the beauty of this. There's Carlos. We, of course, have the poem from Sri Chimnoi. We've got two, in fact. We've got all the beautiful curly writing that goes with an album like this. Can you see? Absolutely amazing. I believe we have an inner sleeve on this. Look at this. This is it. Look at this. Now, the lineup. If you want to know what this is like Santana. It's got singing on, but it's got a lot more souling and a lot more out there-ness. So on the lineup is, of course, Carlos on guitar, Dave Margan on bass, who was the bass player at Santana at the time, Graham Lear on drum, the great Graham Lear, underrated drummer that I think emerged with Gino Vanelli and then jumped over to Santana's later 70s band. He's the drummer on Moonflower, monstrous. We get Greg Walker on vocals, great soulful vocals from the sound. We've got Raul Raquel on percussion, Santana again. It's hard to read this right. And Chris Rhyme on keyboards, and he does a Moog solo on Life is Just a Passing Parade. That's an incredible track. Amaldo Pratzer on congas. Tom Costa from Santana on keyboards and synthesizer. Pete Escovedo on timbales, the dad of Sheila E. Bob Levy is doing the strings and synthesizers. Then we've got narration from Omarilla Santana, maybe his wife at the time. Sanders King on lead guitar and vocals. Claire Fisher on Fender Rose piano. We've got Narada Michael Walden, you know, our master, Lord and Master of this channel, patron of this channel, on piano and Hammond organ. He's not playing drums. And Chris Solberg on Hammond organ and guitar. This is a full-on Santana jazz rock album, and it's so trippy and out there, and it's wonderful. Now, earlier on, I was talking about Billy Cobham and Crosswinds, and how that album got me into jazz rock. But if you want to know the album that pricked up my ear, the very first album that I bought that turned me on to jazz rock, it was this one. Now, is this an essential album? I don't know. For me, it is. For you guys, I keep forgetting to use my stand, don't I? For you guys, maybe not so much. But this is a fantastic album. Cozy Powell, of course, was a drummer with Rainbow. Before that, he was with Jeff Beck. He then went on to join like every metal band going. Michael Schenker Group, White Snake. I think he was in Black Sabbath, and he was in every band. He was also my first drum hero. You know, I first heard him on the Rainbow album, Down to Earth. And so because I was a drummer, I went out and bought this solo album. I was about 12, 13 at the time. And this is not a heavy rock album. This is not a new wave of British heavy metal album, right? This is a weird album. Side one has got a bunch of songs which are sort of in a much more sort of pop orientated, slightly steely, Danish, sophisticated. There's some great players on here. I think pulling a lot of the players from, I think, a band called Bedlam that Cozy Powell had been in, but I'm really pushing my knowledge there. You could check that one out. But when we flip it over onto side two, we get a side of jazz rock. The lineup is Cozy Powell, Jack Bruce, Dave Sanchez, Jeff Beck, Don Airey, Gary Moore. So it's very close to being like the Colosseum 2 band. We've got a couple of Jan Hammer compositions on here, Cat Moose and Hot Rock. And so strong is that sound that I always believed for years that Jan Hammer was on those tracks, but it's actually Dave Sanchez on the one. And on Hot Rock, it is just Moog bass by John Cook and guitars by Jeff Beck. It's incredible. There's some incredible playing, but on here is a track called The Blister. The Blister is a full-on jazz fusion, furious, like aiming for the sunrise track, you know, really coming out of a track like maybe Quadrant 4 by Billy Cobham. It features some of the most incendiary guitar playing from Gary Moore. When I heard The Blister, it just took my face off, and I wanted to hear more of that, which is what took me down the route of what I'm talking to you now. And that track is something else. On side one, we've got a whole bunch of people. We've got the great Elmer Gantry on vocals. Mel Collins is on sax. Neil Murray crops up. Bernie Marsden crops up. We've got Frankie Aiello, who I think he's the guy that was from Bedlam. But I'm really going on some distant knowledge. Chris Glenn on bass, who is in the Michael Schenker Group at the time. And this album came out, let's see how old. Yeah, this came out in 1981, so I was 13 years old. I had it for Christmas that year. Absolute classic for me. Whoops, I just chucked it on the floor. Right, we've got 2 to go, and then we're nearly done. Right, so what shall we do the next one? Okay, 80s jazz rock. 80s jazz rock is a thing, but it's a pretty ropey thing. There's not that much out there, is there? You know, what we're going to listen to. Chick Corea's Electric Band, perhaps. All that stuff that was on GRP, all that middle-of-the-road fusion. All our heroes have, you know, brought in their DX7s and gated drums and sequences, and they don't sound quite right. And it's not a good place for jazz rock. And so it's hard to find great jazz rock albums in the 80s. I thought, I'm going to go and find one. And the one I've pulled out is this, Cloud About Mercury by David Torn. Now, on here we have, from King Crimson at the time, Tony Levin and Bill Bruford. Then we have Mark Isham on trumpet, who made some great albums in the 1980s, very sort of ethereal, moody, sort of, they're not jazz rock albums, they're more ambient, almost like new age, but they're very good. And then the incredible David Torn on guitar, who is in the same realm as a Robert Fripp or an Adrian Belew. He creates incredible ambiances on guitar, textures, sound stuff. He is one of those 80s guitarists that was pushing the use of the guitar to create new sounds. It's something that I feel has been forgotten in guitar playing now. Everyone's trying to get the same sound. Back then, people were trying to get different sounds. David Torn is a real fantastic guitarist, an incredible showcase to him. What does this sound like? Well, if you like the early 80s King Crimson that did Discipline and Beat and Three of a Perfect Pair, imagine that group as a jazz rock group soloing a lot, and that's what you get. One of the most interesting things about this album is that Bill Bruford is playing electric drum kit. And that would put me off, right? He's got Simmons drums on there, he's got synthesizers drums, and then he's got some normal percussion, but he has not got an acoustic kit. And what's interesting, his drums are creating notes and chords that are harmonically work within the framework of the composition. So Bill Bruford is contributing to the harmony. This is the first time I'd ever heard anybody do that on an album, and to this day, it's still probably the best example of a drummer contributing harmonically to a band directly. This is a great album. Right, so we're on to the last one. A fusion band I don't talk about, which I should, because they're British, is Brand X. And Brand X, incredible jazz rock band. They had their own sound. They were described as the UK's Weather Report, but they had a heavier sound than Weather Report, with John Goodsall's blistering guitar playing. For most people, Brand X is that interesting band that Phil Collins had, so people could say, Phil was a really good drummer. He was a really good drummer. You should have heard him in Brand X. We heard him in Brand X. Unorthodox Behaviour, the first album, is the classic one, and then people will talk about, I often will put forth as my favourite album by them, Moroccan Roll. So that's the one I've talked about on this channel. But there's one album that never gets mentioned, and I think if you were to stand back objectively, you could easily say that this is the best Brand X album, and it is this one, Masks. Those of you who know Brand X will be shouting, Andy's totally right. This is one of their best albums, if not their best albums. Right, Brand X are one of the greatest jazz rock fusion bands of all time. Definitely one of the greatest British jazz rock fusion bands of all time. And this is one of their best albums, if not their best album. So what we're looking at here is a bona fide classic. And does anyone ever mention this album? No. And you know why they don't mention? Because of the lineup. On bass, we have the incredible Percy Jones, the British Jaco Pastorius, was doing stuff on fretless bass before Jaco was. We got John Goodsall on guitar, blistering, brilliant. Maurice Pert on percussion, Peter Robinson on keyboards. All the great guys are there. Although I think they would have Robin Lumley was normally the keyboard, so we've got different keyboardists. But on drums we have Chuck Berge. This was made in 1978, and Robin Lumley is the producer of it. That's quite interesting, and I can't tell you why he produced it but didn't play on it. We don't know. So I avoided this as a kid. I wanted ones with Phil Collins on. I didn't want Chuck Berge. Now, Chuck Berge, I might be wrong here, because I've decided to do this video very impromptu and I've done no research, but I feel that he could well have then cropped up later on in Rainbow, and he might have played on Bent Out of Shape. Check it out. This is one of these videos where I'm throwing stuff out, and the point is you have to go to see whether I'm right or wrong, whether my brain circuits at my age are working well enough for me able to access this type of stuff. But Chuck Berge he is off the scale. It's brilliant. But because it's him, this album does not get the credit it should. As do none of any of these. None of these, or all of these, or none of them. Right, I didn't want to do, I really wanted to do like one of my old classic videos with no special sort of editing, or like, where, when I say editing, like where I put a little picture of the album in the corner and do some stuff like that. This is just raw. Right, I filmed this on my phone. I am now going to upload it from my phone to YouTube. I'm not going to create a thumbnail. I'm going to let YouTube create the thumbnail. I just want to go back to see what that's like, raw YouTubing. Bareback YouTubing that I used to do in the old days. Where before it all became important. Stick the camera on, pull out some records, talk about them, bang them up. I didn't care, and I wanted to go back and try one of those. I was sat in my studio, looking at my records, and said, "Well, you've lost your roots, Andy. You're no longer authentic, you stupid surrealness and silliness that you keep doing. Top 10 biscuits this, best moustache this, and then getting all the lefties rolled up with your right-wing politics. And, you know, I thought, you know, all that stuff, that magical mix that you all came here for. And I've forgotten my roots, you know, which has been a proper YouTuber where you come in here, you pull the records out, you don't do really any research, and you rely on this to try and get yourself through the video, which is what I've just done. And if you're appreciating me doing this, then you should go and put a like on this and say, I like this, Andy. And if you want to see me more doing this, more sort of this stuff I'm doing here, I'm not getting my words out well today, then, you know, you'd say in the comments, I like it when you just do that. I like the raw ones, just raw. Go back to the raw. So if you like that, put it in the comments. And then if you want to see more, then subscribe and I'll do some more. If you want to support me, you can go over to Patreon and they can support me over there. And what else can you do? Oh, yes, you can put some money in my PayPal tip jar if you want to support me financially on this bizarre career experiment I'm in at the moment in the latter period of my life, which is being a YouTuber at 56 years old. But somebody's got to do it, haven't they? At least it gives me a little bit of cred with the kids, you know, when people come around the house and say to my kids, you know, what does your dad do? They go, oh, he's a YouTuber. Oh, wow, what's he do? Oh, he talks about prog and jazz rock, especially stuff allied to the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And then he does these weird philosophical videos and comedy stuff every now and then. And they go, ooh. It's not giving my kids any cred, me doing this. They dread me doing something stupid on this channel. But I do it for you lot because I love you all, right? And in these troublesome times, you know, at the weekend, somebody tried to shoot at Trump and they killed someone in the audience. And now, thank God, Trump and Biden have come on and said, why doesn't everyone just wind the rhetoric down? Why doesn't everyone just sort of, you know, try and reach out to people, even though they might not agree with them? And that's what I pray that we will do here. So shall we finish on that note? Anybody who watches my channel, we all love music. It doesn't matter what our political affiliations are because people have different political affiliations so that they can talk to each other and come to, in a Western liberal democracy, a conclusion which is best for all. And we need to argue our case, but civilly and nicely. That's all I've been arguing on this channel for when I do bring my political affiliations. And God, this is serious. I didn't mean to say that. But this is what's on my mind at the moment, and that's what you get. Anyway, I've got to do a lesson now with a new student. They're going to arrive in 4 minutes, my phone tells me. So I'm going to get out of here and see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.